Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to be thinking about how to plan an essay, what to do, how to put it together as a plan so that when you start doing proper writing and putting it all together, you can use your notes, you can use your reading and just get on with it. You're not facing a few thousand words, you're just facing chunks of smaller pieces, which I think for making it less intimidating, if this is unfamiliar to you, but also for planning your time and planning your resource management. You might not have time to sit down and think about 500 to 1,000 words or more in one go, but you will find space for 200 to 300 words. That we can do. So helping you to break down a bigger piece into smaller pieces. Thinking as well, very importantly, about the purpose of each section within a paper. So we're going to be looking at an introduction, main body, conclusion structure. You might be working on pieces that are more research report style, and therefore introduction, methods, results, discussion, conclusion, and so therefore you'll need to break down that main body a little bit further, but you can still apply the same technique and process of what we're doing today. So I'm going to be working through a example of an essay that I used to mark and teach for my second year students. We no longer use it, so it's perfect. I'm not giving anything away that is still being used, and it's a really nice, simple concept. So I teach mental health nursing, and what we had the students do was watch a video of a patient character talking about depression and talking about their symptoms. I don't think they even explicitly said I have depression, just talking about low mood, social withdrawal and disengaging with activities, sleep disturbance, diet disturbance, all sorts of very typical classic symptoms, and the students should, especially by second year, be able to pick up, oh, that Donna's probably got depression. And so what we needed them to do was two key things. We needed them to show that they could assess what was going on with her and why we do certain assessments and what the strengths and weaknesses of those are. And then the other thing we needed was focus around what would you do? If you were Donna's nurse, what would you do? What would your care plan be? Those are the learning objectives of the module. So have a think about the learning objectives that you've been using and that are attached to your module. If you're not sure what they are, find them in the module handbook and make sure that what you're performing in your assignment is going to include that. Have a think back as well to the video that I've done previously on things to do before you get started. If you haven't watched that, go watch that, because that chronologically in the essay writing process comes before this one, where you're figuring out what are you doing, what's the goal, who are you writing for, but now we're going to start planning. So the first thing I really want you to think about is what you're going to be demonstrating, and there's two parts to this. There's the first part, which often comes to mind a lot more readily, which is content knowledge. What do they need to know that I know? What kinds of information have I learnt in my classes that I've got notes about? Do I need to show I know some things? I know some things. So that's content and concept knowledge, but there is crucially also a second section that is often less explicitly recognised and less explicitly talked about when in like assessment tutorials or in classes, and that is what process knowledge are we assessing you on. So if you were to be writing a literature review, for example, it's fantastic that you know the content of the subject of your review. I would hope so, given how much reading you have to do for a literature review. Cool. But a large chunk of that assessment is going to be, do you understand the scientific process? Do you understand research methodologies? Do you understand how to critically analyse a study for its method? How to critically analyse the results and what impact that might have on your results? Do you understand the scientific process? For the assignment that we're doing with Donna, the content knowledge is, do you know what depression is? Do you know what assessment tools we might use for different clinical needs and different types of symptoms? And can you develop a coherent initial care plan about what might be an appropriate intervention or combination of interventions or the symptoms that you've identified? And then articulating your knowledge in the content stuff is part of your process assessment. Can you express what's in your head, right? And that's quite difficult for a lot of people. A lot of us find we have the knowledge up here. If we're asked about it in class, if we're asked about it by a friend, we have the knowledge and we can express ourselves verbally perhaps, but actually getting it onto paper and articulating ourselves effectively and in an academic professional tone is the tricky bit. But that is one of the skills you'll be assessed on. Other skills we were looking at process-wise here was critical analysis, the ability to compare and contrast two possibilities. So when we're thinking about care plan interventions, we could, for Donna, go for CBT therapy, medication, occupational therapy, group social prescribing. We could do a whole bunch of different stuff. I would tell students you can put Donna on the moon to pet a dog as long as you can justify it. And so thinking about just how do we justify clinical decisions? Do you know the resources and how to use the resources like NICE guidelines for making those judgments, for making those decisions? So thinking about not just critiquing the strengths and weaknesses of interventions or assessment tools or whatever the content that you're doing is, but also making a sensible conclusion from that. So I found these strengths and weaknesses of medication. There's loads of strengths and loads of weaknesses of medication. Fantastic. How do I make a conclusion about overall, is medication a good idea? And then what I would find was sort of a stretcher process knowledge skill, right? Not everyone would get it. Some would. And that was where you typically had high performing students would get this one, would be thinking about how do we make this person centered to Donna? How is Donna's presentation, her demographics, her symptoms, how are we making sure that we are focusing these interventions or these assessment tools to Donna specifically and not somebody else who has the same symptoms? So making that higher level analytical adjustment to person-centered care. So my first task for you is to get a piece of paper and write down what are your content skills that you're going to show, what is the content knowledge that your marker needs to know that you know, and then what are the process skills that you need to show your marker that you understand and can do. So write those two lists down, and then that will guide you in the next step. So step 2 is gathering your thoughts, and I would typically do this as a pen and paper exercise because it can be a bit scattered, and that's really valuable. If you like a mind map, do a mind map, but whatever method works. I love a bullet point. And thinking about what is the thread that's running through to keep this coherent. So in the context of the example essay, it would be choose one type of symptom, because it's no point talking about I'm going to assess sleep hygiene, but then I'm going to talk about social inclusion interventions. Very jarring, very confusing. You have to cover a lot of ground in not that many words. No, thank you. If we're going to assess sleep hygiene, we're going to do interventions for sleep hygiene. If we're going to assess mood, we're going to do interventions for mood. So what is the thread of your topic? And it might not be such a prominent need within what you're writing. It depends on what it is, but have a think about what that thread is. And also make a note as you're gathering your ideas of what are the key points you want to make. There will be things that you have thought of, that you've come across in your reading, in your classes, things that you're like, I need to make sure that's in there. I need to cover this. I need to think about this. Have a little brain dump of all of those things before moving on to the next step. And the next step is, in part, organising what you've just done in step 2, and in other part, starting to do your reading. So for this essay, my example essay, I would make a grid of strengths and weaknesses of assessment tool 1, PHQ-9, and assessment tool 2, Beck's Depression Inventory, and do it as a grid. And as I'm going through my reading, I'm going to make notes of what fits in each grid, keeping those links to the papers and the texts where I've got those bits of information from. You can structure that however you like, but for me, a grid works really nicely. So have a think about what are the key points you want to make, and what are the things that support that point, and can you predictively find critiques of that point? Can you predictively find critiques of a concept or a model that you're now analysing, and also make notes of those? And if you want to do it as a table or if you want to do it as a list, doesn't matter, but start as you're reading to group your notes, and this is very much easier done on a laptop. Group your notes based on what they're coming through. So rather than just a whole mix of different things, as you go paper by paper, start to pull those bits together. Awesome. Now we are on to how do we start structuring the essay itself, rather than structuring our notes so that they could go into this essay structure. How do we start structuring the essay itself, and what is the purpose of each section? So when you're writing a conclusion, and I'm going to start at the end, which might seem a bit odd and it might seem a bit brash how I describe it, but when we're thinking about our introduction, our main body, and our conclusion, we need to think about what they're there to do. It's part of playing the game, it's part of structuring your plan, and it's part of making sure that you also understand the structure of an academic writing piece, right? If you're going to get points for structure, to have the right stuff in the right place is also a process skill. It's a process skill on every assessment, so it's not often mentioned, and you might not have put it in your list, no worries. But it's still a process skill that you need to show. So what is it that we need to put in a conclusion? Well, a conclusion very likely won't have many references in, right? You're not introducing any new references. You might have one or two that's like the key, but across a conclusion, not many references. So you're not getting points for referencing skills, for citation skills, for bringing in pieces of data. Okay, what about analysis? Well, you shouldn't get critical analysis points in a conclusion. You're not doing the analysis in the conclusion. All of that is above, right? All of your critical analysis, that's done in the main body. So your conclusion won't be getting you any points for that. Okay, so structuring content. Yeah, a conclusion should be summarising the information from the main body, saying here is what we've learned, in case you've forgotten, here is ultimately the bottom line of, we thought about this, we thought about this, we thought about this, and in the end, this was the most important consideration, or this was the approach that we would go for with Donna. This was the final outcome and the take home, the key take home piece from my review. So if you're going to remember anything from this essay, read my conclusion and you've got it summarized. So we're not introducing new information, and we're not likely to be providing any, and if any, many references. But it does need to be there. You do need a conclusion, and it does need to say something sensible. But that's it. It just needs to be there, and it just needs to say something sensible, right? It can be short and sweet and simple and just say, hey, here's a quick summary of the stuff above. Or it can be gorgeous and complex and very, like, drawing in lots of different pieces. But where you're able to get marks and play the game, there's a not enormous difference between a good conclusion and an excellent conclusion compared to a good main body and an excellent main body, a good introduction and an excellent introduction. The gap between quite good and excellent in your introduction main body is huge. But actually, I could pick out an essay that got 80% and the conclusion will look quite similar structure-wise and content-wise to the essay that got 42%. The main difference will probably be around academic writing style. And that's separate. That's not to do with how you're planning. That's about academic writing skills. And I'm sure we'll have a separate video on that. But there's not that much difference. Whereas an introduction that is 42% worthy and an introduction that is 72, 82% worthy, wildly different. Really, really different. So your conclusion, is it there? Does it say something sensible? Done. Structure, done. Fantastic. Let's go back to the introduction. What is the purpose of an introduction? Well, it's there to give context to your reader. And you might be thinking, but Ella, my lecturer who's marking this has been reading 20 other essays on the same thing. They have loads of context. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. But they want to make sure that you are showing that. That's one of the process skills. That's one of the expectations. It's like I said in the what to do before you start writing video about thinking about who your audience is. Yeah, they should know this information. Yes, they are probably very familiar with the texts that you're going to cite. They've probably told you this explicitly in class with them. But we need to know that about you. So you're going to give context. You're going to set the scene. In this example, a video was provided showing Donna discussing her symptoms. These symptoms were suggestive of depression. For example, she mentioned low mood, social withdrawal, and sleep disturbance. Here is the DSM-5 or the ICD reference that tells us that those are the symptoms of depression. Then thinking about, in this essay, I will, but not saying I, but here's what to expect. I know what depression is. Here is a definition of depression. I'm going to focus on mood. Well, okay, if I'm going to focus on mood, what is a definition of mood? Do you and I have the same understanding of what it is for someone to have mood and low mood? And what does that mean? What is sleep hygiene? If I'm going to look at her sleep hygiene, what does that mean? Do you have the same understanding of sleep hygiene as me? The answer is probably yes, but it's to make sure that if your reader is unfamiliar with the topic, that they're on the same page. It's to make sure that as well, your marker knows that you actually know what you're talking about. And if you're finding that your topic, your subject of your piece of work is something where there's actually quite a contested understanding of what is it, what is that definition, which is more common in sort of philosophical and ethical based social studies topics, well, fantastic. Talk about, many people will define this in this way, but actually some would define it in this other way. And that is one of the contentions that is going to be considered in this piece of work. Fantastic. That's not just showing I've accepted one definition and I'm going to move forward with that. Actually, I am aware that there are multiple different things to think about, and part of the context and setting the scene of what's about to happen is that we're going to look at both of these. So think about, what do I need to introduce? What do I need to show that I know? What do I need to tell them to expect? How do I do this? And this is probably a nice point when you're thinking about writing your essay, to think about how do you manipulate what you're writing about to your own personal interests. I say manipulate. A colleague of mine would always say shape and create, because it sounds a bit nicer. But I would say manipulate. Any opportunity you have to manipulate your work to your own interests, you'll always do better. So have a think with your introduction when you're planning your essay. How can I manipulate this to what I want to do? For this next part, I'm going to be using a screen recording of me essentially writing out what I'm describing. So I'm not just gesturing and suggesting things, so that you can really see what my idea looks like. But because of that, I've got a screen open and it's reflecting in my glasses. So please just leave it be. There's no way we can really get around that. But what we're going to think about is the main body section. So the essay that we're thinking about is 3,000 words long. My introduction is going to be about 500 words. My conclusion, it just needs to be there and it just needs to be sensible. Well, that's going to be no more than 500 words. And that leaves us about 2,000 words to play with. Fantastic. I've got 2,000 words. So on my essay plan, I'm going to write main body 2,000 words so that it's constantly in my mind. Now, what we're putting into our main body, well, there's two things we're thinking about. Part A, we're thinking about assessment tools. Part B, we're thinking about interventions. So I'm going to start with part A, and I've written that down. And obviously half of 2,000 is 1,000. So we've got 1,000 words, keeping that in mind. Fantastic. Within part A, when I talk about assessment tools, I need to compare and contrast. If I just talk about one assessment tool, it doesn't show very much breadth of knowledge at all. It just tells you that I know about the PHQ-9. And quite frankly, there's not even that much to say about it. There's not even that much to say about more complex assessment tools. So we're definitely going to look at two. Depth is always more valuable than breadth, which is why we're not looking at three. We do not have within 1,000 words space to look at 3 assessment tools in enough depth and to summarize them. We simply do not have, right? If I'm going to give 200 words to my summary of assessment tools, my micro conclusion, 200 might be generous. Even if I gave it 100, 300 words per tool for 3 tools would not be enough to get the depth that I need. So it does need to be 2 lots of 400. So I've got my tool 1 and I've got my tool 2, 400 words each. And then, as I've already said, my summary, my conclusion, what's the most persuasive argument, which one of these, when I go to meet Donna in person, am I going to use to assess her mental health? Actually, is there anything that both of these assessment tools don't include? Yes, they don't include qualitative assessment of loads of other psychosocial factors. Okay, well, that's going in my conclusion. Fantastic. We then are just going to do the same structure again, because the second half of this essay is like that. Now you might not be doing such a compare and contrast shaped piece, so this might not necessarily be necessary, but what I'm going to do, I am going to copy and paste all of part A, and we're going to do it again, but instead of part A, this is part B, and we're going to think about interventions. My first type of intervention, I'm going to think about medication. My second type of intervention, let's go with something nice and classic, CBT. And then we're going to do a summary of interventions, concluding the persuasive arguments that I've just made, and using that same 400, 400, 200 structure. Awesome. Now I've got that, that is the overarching structure that all of my ideas are going to go into. The next step I have is breaking down each of these topic areas. So within PHQ9, I'm going to write some questions about what do I need to have answered and told my marker to show that I've got an understanding of the PHQ9. Well, I need to tell them, what is it? What does it do? Why is it good? Right? That's a blunt way of saying what's its advantages. And what does it miss? And other disadvantages. Lovely. Is there anything else that I want to include? What is it? What does it do? And how does it work? Lovely. So between these questions, I mean, those first three are kind of very, very similar, so they might end up being merged into two. But essentially, I've got 80 to 100 words to answer each of those questions. Fantastic. I'm going to repeat those for BDI. Okay, lovely. And then the questions that I need to be able to answer for my summary are, which one comes out on top overall and why? Right, that's what those 200 words needs to answer. So what I've done now is taken something that used to be 2,000 words, even 1,000 words, just thinking about the assessment tool part. Okay, well now it's 400 words. That's way more manageable already. And now it's 5 lots of 80 to 100 words. That is way, way, way more manageable. And when I'm doing my reading, I can very, very easily now just answer one question at a time. So I'm going to do my reading, and as I get notes coming through, what is the PHQ9? Oh, okay, well there's a paper by, I don't know, Jones and so-and-so, Jones et al, 2026, and they say that it's a assessment tool with 9 questions that review the key symptoms of depression based on the DSM criteria. Fantastic. What's that? That's a definition. That's telling you that I know what it is. So as I write my notes, I'm going to make a reference to the paper, and I will, I'll often do it with a comment, add a new comment, and in that comment I will put the link to the paper itself, so that my future self, when it comes to putting my references in the reference list, I'm ready to do that. And depending on what you like to do, some people like to do it all in one go and just have an afternoon of writing up references. I often like to do it as I go, but I have found that every so often I will forget one, and it's always the one that I find is missing when I go back to look at my own work for things that I want to cite for future papers. So maybe keep onto them all in a link and then do it in one go at the end so that you don't forget any. But as I'm answering my questions, I'm going to start putting those little bits of answers in. Why is it good? It is short, you can do it yourself, can be done remote, and measurable. They love it, especially in cognitive behavioural therapy. They love it because you can get a score, and then you can be rescored in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year to see if you're getting better or worse. Like, it's lovely quantitative data about that. Fantastic. Who has told me why this is good? Was it me? No, it wasn't me. I haven't got papers on that, on the measurable values of PHQ9. But thinking about those things and putting it in as you go. And then doing that same thing for answering each of these other questions again. And so, as you can assume, I'm about to say, we're going to do the same thing for part B. What are the questions that I need to answer about medication? Well, I need to tell them what it is. Okay, so, well, medication we kind of all have a good understanding of that. But what types of antidepressants are there? There are 3 types. How do I know that? What is my reference? So breaking down each of these things into lots of little questions means that when you go out to look through your notes from class, when you go to look through your reading and the notes that you've made from your pre-essay reading, you can make sure that you are answering those. So you've got this ready, and it's so easy, right? You've got 30, 40, maybe more, but 30 short answer questions to do. And that is so much easier than writing a few thousand words. What comes after that is using those bullet pointed answers, those little bits of answers that you've picked up from your notes and from your reading, and start turning that into full sentences that are written in an effective style. So you've got your macro structure, you know how big each section needs to be, and that you've got all the right subheadings for sections. You know what the plan is for each of those little chunks broken down. Fantastic. Now you're going to turn that into a coherent full paragraph, or multiple coherent full paragraphs really. So each of those answers to each of your questions will be a full paragraph. So what is medication? Why is medication valuable? And what are the disadvantages of medication for treatment of depression? Person-centered nursing care for Donna. How does this specifically influence Donna? What about her presentation, her demographics, all of these kind of things? Each of those will be its own paragraph. Well, fantastic. I had 4 questions. I now have 4 paragraphs. And these will be a lot more in depth, right, than the bullet points that you had, but that will guide your structure. Fantastic. You've now got all these paragraphs that are there. You've probably got quite close to your word count. I would say maybe you find yourself at 80%. You might be someone that's found themselves over and you're at like 150%, and you've got to figure out how to cut that back. But the next task is, you've got these lots of disjointed paragraphs, is to review the flow, the microstructure. Does this sentence follow to this sentence? Does that sentence follow to the 3rd and to the 4th? Does it actually make sense? What is the story that I am telling? And then does this paragraph link to that paragraph? And does that link to this one as well? Or am I bitting and bopping and I'm all over the place? So now you're going to take your 20 mismatched paragraphs and turn them into 20 coherent paragraphs, or however many you've got, right? You need 1 point per paragraph and 1 paragraph per point. So don't try and squeeze 2 paragraphs together. It doesn't help. It makes things confusing. 1 paragraph per point, new paragraph. Fantastic. But make sure that things flow in the right order. So you might find yourself cut and pasting things up and down. But once you've done all of that, cut and pasting up and down, you've reviewed your microstructure, you now will have a very good piece of work. You're at like 90%, 95% of the way there. Your final task is not structure based, and it is reviewing what you're doing and going back to your skills lists. Have I showed off all the content knowledge that I wanted to show off? And have I demonstrated the skills that I'm being asked to demonstrate as well? Check through that, adjust as you go, make sure you're playing the game, and boost up any areas that you think you can find. You might also use this time for proofreading, but I would personally recommend waiting until it's like 98, 99% done to do tiny little proofreads, tiny little adjustments there. But that is my guide to how to write an essay plan and how to structure an essay plan for easy essay writing. If you like this video, do give it a thumbs up. If you're unsure about certain things, put those questions in the comments. And especially if you've got video requests, please also leave me a comment, and I'll do my best to get around to those requests as well as the other videos that I've got planned coming up. Thank you very much, and I will see you soon.